thank you to those of you that have joined promptly. We will give it 1 more minute past the hour to allow for the others to join, and then we will get started. Right, so we are 1 minute past the hour, so I think it's a good time to get started. Big hello, hola, and welcome to you all. Thank you for all joining on time and joining us for the first of the Beat the Heat webinars covering the Americas region. Thank you for joining us here today to learn and discuss about one of the most pressing challenges facing cities globally. I'm Rashmi Ladwa with Arup, and I'm delighted to open this webinar being hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme UNEP and technical partner to Beat the Heat Arup, which is a global built environment consultancy with offices across the world. I'm going to just go through how we enable the live captions feature here on Teams today. So if you look at the 3 dots at the top of your screen, there should be this function in your meeting toolbar. And if you select choose language and speech, you can turn on live captions and select the language of your choice. So if that's something you'd like to do, please feel free to do so now, and I will go through the agenda for today. So in a short moment, I will introduce our UNEP host, Eleni Miravilli, followed by an interactive icebreaker. And we do invite you all to interact and participate in this, so please do feel free to do so. Then we will introduce the climate emergency framework, which we've put together, and we'll go through in more detail with you all. Then followed by a very short break and another icebreaker segment. And then we'll cover off the rest of the framework, concluding with a conclusion of the whole webinar. And then for the last half an hour, we plan to go through a bit more of an interactive session where we invite you to ask questions to our panel of experts. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Eleni Miravilli, Global Chief Heat Officer for UNEP, UN Habitat, and Atlantic Council's Climate Resilience Centre. So I will pause and hand over to Eleni. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here at the very first meeting of Beat the Heat in the new year and in the new phase of the whole project, which we just announced and launched in Belém. And I will move this forward, ideally. Just a minute. Request control. I should be doing, yes, here we go. So, so I'm going to give an introduction for Beat the Heat. And it all started with the Global Cooling Pledge, which was an initiative launched in the UAE at COP28. And it basically was a science-based roadmap to reduce emissions and protect people from heat. It was the first of its kind based on cooling. It brought together a strong leadership with co-chairs being from the UAE and Brazil, then chairing the Global Cooling Pledge, and 73 countries joined it, agreeing to implement the commitments and the action. Part of the Global Cooling Pledge were subnational commitments, and these when we started coming, when we these and oops, sorry guys, this is. Let me go back. Okay. And as we were approaching this COP, the Brazil COP of this year, which was last November, the Brazilian presidency worked together with UNEP and the Cool Coalition to create what we call an implementation drive, realizing that we really needed, in order to get the Global Cooling Pledge actually pushed forward and into implementation, we needed to get cities much more involved, and we needed to figure out how to actually create capacity so that cities could start implementing and resilience measures and cooling measures to protect their lives of the people and the livelihoods of people. So we focus on these three subnational commitments. The first subnational commitment has to do with conducting heat island assessments, figuring out how to map heat in cities, but also how to map vulnerability, to create heat action plans, to prioritize different activities from the heat action plans, and to create project-ready, bankable proposals. The second part had to do with passive cooling, focusing on nature-based solutions, but other types of passive cooling as well, such as cool roofs, or even the different types of building codes and policies that cities can put together for passive cooling. And the third one had to do with active cooling and creating more sustainable cooling, especially through helping cities change their procurement and make sure that they they procured high efficiency cooling technologies, especially in public buildings. So these are the three basic buckets with which we are planning to work with cities through Beat the Heat. And up to the end of this year, more than 200 cities have expressed interest and have joined this effort. From all around the world. You can see here the countries and the different cities that joined, but also we had a great interest from more than 100 partners who also joined joined this effort. So this is the first time that we have a global ecosystem of people that are both working on heat and working on heat solutions, as well as cities that are basically ground zero for their need to actually address heat and create more cool environments for their people and for their survival of the cities in general. So what are we doing now? We're just starting to actually, we're starting the first year of Beat the Heat. And the first thing that we will do, and you will, all the cities that are part of Beat the Heat will get a survey before the end of this month that will build a comprehensive overview of what the city's current heat resilience efforts are, as well as identify key gaps and priority areas for action. So we're asking the cities to really give us feedback as to what exactly, where they are at, and what are the priorities that they want to work on. We're doing a similar kind of survey with all the partners. For the first months, we have lined up, and Arup was our first partner to do this. We have lined up a series of capacity building and training sessions, which are a lighter lift, and we can actually move forward to actually give our cities this actually very valuable side that a lot of cities need to kind of try to understand how to move forward with the methodological and the more organizational parts of how do you start creating heat action plans? How do you start planning and understanding how to move forward? We have a series of partners lined up that will be working with us in the next few months. And also we have some peer-to-peer exchange activities starting with Paris, and some other cities that actually want to share with other cities and go through seminars and go through workshops to share different types of expertise that they have built around heat. And this is to build momentum in order to start really kind of, after we know better what is needed, to build the right kind of programs and bring the right kind of funding to support cities with more specifically passive cooling and active cooling needs that they might have. And I will close at this point and give the floor to Maggie Messerschmidt, who is a senior resilience consultant at Arup in California. She supports the public and private sector in better understanding vulnerabilities and preparing for and responding to climate change. And with Maggie, we have Adam Jaffe, who is a senior materials engineer at Arup, and he is at the New York office. He specializes in a variety of disciplines and has been involved in projects that concern extreme heat resilience, but also corrosion design, asset durability, nanomaterials, structural dynamics, and remote monitoring buildings. So I leave you now at the expert hands of Maggie and Adam.
Thank you, Eleni. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hello, my name is Adam Jaffe. I won't repeat my introduction, it was very kind. Maggie and I will be walking you through over the course of the next hour this discussion as brought together by UNEP. So thank you again, Eleni, for the introduction. I want to begin by describing the objectives for today's seminar. A really important aim of it is to help you reflect on where your own city currently stands in its journey to respond to extreme heat. And so we want to help you clarify in your own minds what you want to achieve, how the Beat the Heat campaign can help you achieve those aims. So you'll be asked at the end by UNEP to complete a short questionnaire about the type of support you would find most useful, and what we cover today can be helpful in preparing that. And we stand ready to support you as best possible. The 4 aims specifically that we want to cover with the content of this webinar are listed on the screen. First, we want to provide an opportunity for cities to engage immediately following the announcements of Beat the Heat at the recent COP. We want to establish a framework that offers cities a structured approach to understand and respond to their heat challenges, and this is a framework that you can take forward and apply during your participation in Beat the Heat. We want to help you develop knowledge and skills around urban heat, and this can relate to data, tools, and solutions, which will be part of the topic of discussion in my sections. And we want to share examples about how heat has been understood and addressed in peer cities around the world. So we'll begin with a short questionnaire, and I invite you, if you'll find the link in the chat as well shortly, somebody will add it, and you can also join through the QR code on the screen if you have your phone. If you struggle with access to it, please feel free to just put your answer in the chat as well. But what we'd ask you to do is to rank some of the priorities listed here as regards your city. Are you concerned about climate hazards, extreme heat, water, drought, water scarcity, wildfire? I can see there's another one at the bottom, but I can't read it. Or others, please list so we can have some sense of the relative priority of these different climate hazards that your city faces. Okay, so we see A few responses coming in now. Flooding, drought, water-related are priority, air pollution, water and water scarcity towards the top, extreme heat towards the top. Okay, today's webinar is appropriate for the audience. We'll give this maybe another minute until we hit 20, 25 responses. And I'll say, as we see these responses come in, of course, many of these different hazards are interrelated. Extreme heat, of course, corresponds in many cases to drought or water issues, flooding and water issues naturally intertwined. Extreme heat also is linked to air pollution in ways that I can describe perhaps in the Q&A, but many of these climate hazards are correlated. And so it's no surprise that cities are confronting many of them going forward. Rashmi, maybe we advance, and if folks want to continue to fill that out, we can share back as a summary of the group. So I want to give a brief introduction. What are the trends that we're seeing as regards global heating, and what does it mean for cities? And in the next slide, I'll give a brief, again, introduction to the climate emergency, but I'm sure that it requires very little discussion from me. 3 years ago at COP26, there was an agreement globally that 1.5 degrees of warming was a safe ceiling. We've already exceeded that in 2024. And it seems that we're on a trajectory for something between the range of 2.5 and 3 degrees Celsius. But there are projections that depending on the amount of greenhouse gases that humans globally add to the environment could be much more extreme than that. And so the trajectories are somewhat uncertain. They diverge in the later years of this century. And so we need to plan for an uncertain future, but one that certainly includes warming. And what we see, the consequences of these changes in the climate are weather anomalies around the globe and in the Americas as well. These include things like tropical storms, dumping huge amounts of rain, extreme heat events, bringing heat waves that last longer than ever previously recorded, reaching temperatures higher than ever previously recorded, affecting cities never previously affected. And all of these are felt, in microcosm in the Americas as well. And the impacts are diverse in character. We'll talk about this in one of the later stages as well, but to give you a preview, they span not only impacts to human health and well-being, but also biodiversity, health and well-being. They can cause downtime to infrastructure and services. The diversity of causes is incredible. They can cause economic consequences in form of decreased productivity of people working, for example, in hot conditions or sleeping poorly overnight, and they're not prepared to work the next day. The consequences affect almost all aspects of our environment and our way of being. In the Americas, these have been quantified in recent studies, and to give you a sense of scale of the problem, which may be one of the most extreme of all climate hazards that we face. In the United States, just in the last year, more than 3/4 of the population faced at one point in the year dangerous or life-threatening conditions. These are triple-digit Fahrenheit, so 40 plus Celsius temperatures plus high humidity. So 3/4 of the U.S. population only in the past year faced those extremes. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the heat-related mortality rates have more than doubled since the 10 years ending in 2009 to the 10 years ending in 2022. And we'll see what the statistics look like slightly more current than that. And more than 70% of workers in the Americas were exposed to extreme heat again in 2020. So perhaps that condition has gotten worse. And on this point, it's important to recognize that certain kinds of heat injuries might be characterized as such, something like heat stroke. But there are other kinds of injuries that happen because of lapse of concentration. For example, where somebody who is working with a piece of equipment mishandles it because they're struggling for exposure to the heat. So some of these injuries and things may not be counted. It may be even an undercount besides. So the impacts are diverse. What we see in the next slide is that the risks of urban heat, the risks of extreme heat are more severe in urban environments because of what's called the urban heat island effect. In English, the acronym is UHI, so you'll see that on our slides. And what the urban heat island effect describes is the phenomenon that extreme heat or temperatures are generally higher in cities as compared to their rural surroundings. And this is because cities are built up from materials like concrete and asphalt that tend to be darker and absorb heat from the sun more so than trees and other living things in rural areas. Also in cities, we have vehicles that exhaust heat. We have buildings that exhaust heat and many other sources of heat that tend to be trapped in the confines of the city where perhaps in rural areas they can be ventilated away or never trapped at all. And so what we anticipate is that the extreme heat challenge of the future is really an urban heat challenge of the future, and why the levers for mitigating extreme heat going forward are in the hands of cities. So we think that there's a framework that we call the 3A framework that helps cities understand how they can respond to extreme heat. And our 3As are analyze, assess, and act. And I want to say that this dovetails very, very nicely with the priorities as described by the Beat the Heat campaign. So I'll, just to make sure that we're all aware of the terminology, I'll signpost that as we go. When we say analyze, what we mean is we want to analyze urban heat patterns using different kinds. Oh, sorry, Rashmi, on the previous slide. We want to analyze urban heat patterns using different kinds of data, sometimes using advanced methodologies if those are available to us. And this allows us to identify hotspots, to understand the causes of heat, and eventually to deliver actionable insights for evidence-based mitigation planning. And for assess, now that we understand the heat hazard, we want to understand the impacts. And this means understanding risks and vulnerabilities to our fellow citizens, to our infrastructure. We can do qualitative and quantitative assessments to identify different exposures, evaluate the relative impact, and then provide an evidence base for prioritizing adaptation investments. These align well with the priority that Beat the Heat campaign has identified to conduct urban heat island assessments and prepare action plans. And then following those steps, it's to act, which is to turn that strategy into action by designing and delivering heat adaptation interventions. These can be engineering measures, they can be advisory solutions that affect the operations of assets, tailored to the challenges that we're facing. And again, this aligns with what Beat the Heat has described as their two priorities, second and third priorities, which are to implement nature-based solutions in passive cooling projects and to prioritize high efficiency cooling technologies in our actions. So these frameworks, again, the purpose of these frameworks is to help cities understand how to move through from contemplating the heat challenge and then acting on it. Next slide, please, Rashmi, thank you. So I'll begin first with analyze, and then I'll present assess after. And the question with analyze is, how can we use data and tools to identify and interpret heat patterns in our urban environments? Really, we're asking a series of questions like, how is heat distributed across the city? Where are there hot spots? Where does it get hot? Excuse me, when does it get hot? How hot does it get? Who is most affected? Can we identify underlying causes of the heat? And when we have this evidence base, eventually it will allow us to prioritize interventions to mitigate the worst impacts. Next slide, please. What we'll present over this period is a series of highly developed presentations of data, but I want to start with a disclaimer because it's not necessary to have perfect data sets of all of the variables that we'll describe in the next section to better understand the impacts of heat on your city. In fact, it's very likely that you already have or can readily get access to certain kinds of data that will help you. So again, please start with what's available to you because that's very likely to be meaningful. Why do we need data on heat? And the answer to this question is quite simple. Extreme heat is not uniform. It's not uniform across geography at pretty much any scale. You can see on the picture here that the populations of people affected by extreme heat varies across the globe. You know, there are concentrations, for example, in South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, but then across the whole range of latitudes in the Americas as well. And it varies even down to the street level or the neighborhood level in cities. So if we want to do something about heat, we need to understand this variability. If you go to the next slide, we'll see that different kinds of visualizations can be very helpful in understanding the problem. Some kinds of visualizations that we'll present or that can be useful include heat maps. We'll see many of these. They can be line graphs that track, for example, rising temperatures. They could track the frequency of heat waves over time. Bar charts, likewise, can help you compare between neighborhoods or between different periods of time. What we see on the screen is a scatter plot, which illustrates the relationship between heat and health outcomes. So on the left side, we see the days per year that the max temperatures exceed 35 Celsius by city and grouped by continent. On the left side, in a 1.5 degree warming scenario, and on the right side, in a 3-degree warming scenario. And what I notice, for example, in these plots, if we look at South Asia, the yellow at the top, you can see that the number of extreme days, the whole plot shifts to the right, indicating that generally across the entire group of cities, the number of days is increasing almost monotonically. If you look instead at Middle East and North Africa, or at Sub-Saharan Africa, you see that the width of the plot gets wider and wider, which means that in some places, some unlucky places, the number of extreme days is growing very significantly. And this wide tail helps us understand the scale of the problem, how many people might be facing it. These kinds of visualizations, again, can be of any diverse type, but we've found success in communicating the issue through heat maps, through plots like these, line charts and bar charts as well. Next, we'll talk about different data sources that can be useful to understand heat and its impacts. First, of course, is climate and weather data. So these can come from historical records. They can come from real-time temperature measurements, from humidity measurements, which are often available at airports. For example, those are taken consistently, usually in 10-minute or even, hourly or even 10-minute intervals. You can use remote sensing or satellite imagery. This is very useful to produce heat maps and other spatial mapping. You can use socioeconomic and vulnerability data sets. So these could include characteristics like population density, age group, if you have information about housing quality. All of this is relevant ultimately to the experience of heat. You can also, if you have a network of we call IoT, Internet of Things, but small local sensors distributed around the city that can make local observations of heat or heat conditions. These can be ground-based sensors. They can be weather stations, either owned by the city or by private individuals, or other networks that offer the possibility of getting granular data. And then another category, not shown on the screen, but health and emergency response data. And this can include hospital admissions, including for things coded as heat-related illnesses, but also those that are not, since heat exacerbates many kinds of illnesses as well. Emergency service calls during heat events likewise can give some indication about the scale of the problem in a heat event. If you go to the next slide, please. So you have a huge diversity of data at your disposal. How do you organize it and present this in a way that can drive towards meaningful action? There are a handful of different ways that we think could be successful. One uses GIS platforms. GIS is an acronym in English that stands for Geographic Information Services. So you're using spatial data and organizing it in layers so that you can see the interrelation between different characteristics. We use tools like ArcGIS or QGIS to do this. You can also produce dashboards, for example, with tools like Power BI that allow you to trial different scenarios, or they can be fed by real-time data sets to allow monitoring conditions as they occur. You can do spatial mapping to produce heat risk models. These can either be simulated, they can map existing tools like through GIS, but they can be simulated to allow you to understand the impact of making certain interventions like adding green space or changing building materials. And depending on your capacity, you could also consider incorporating these into your planning and design using advanced tools that allow for the assessment of microclimates and other conditions that might be highly local to certain areas of the city and responsive to things like the orientation of the buildings. I'll conclude before a case study in this section by talking about the challenges. No, the next slide, please, Rashmi, thank you. Which the challenges are numerous because there are huge amounts of data and from a wide variety of sources as we've identified. The greatest challenge relates to the complexity of integrating all of these data sets. You might have data sets from within the city, data sets from vendors that you purchase, for example, satellite data. You might have demographic data that comes from a state or a national resource, and combining these into making them speak the same language, so to speak, can be a challenge, and it's often where a significant amount of effort needs to be invested upfront. There are also challenges regarding resource constraints. Some of the modeling software that I described can be expensive or require expert use. And so in the case of a city, this might need to be contracted to an expert or a consultant. The risks in the underlying data set themselves that can propagate into your analysis. So vulnerable communities, we'll discuss in the second section in greater detail, they're often underrepresented in some of these data sets, and there's a risk of bias if the analysis uses those data sets without interrogating for social context. And so if you can overcome these challenges, for example, with community engagement, then that will lay the foundation for building a robust and inclusive urban heat response. There are data gaps and quality issues. This is true of any data set, whether you get the granularity that you require, the temporal granularity, the spatial granularity. If the data sets were paused, they're not continuous, these can all introduce complexities. And finally, as we discussed at the beginning, there's uncertainty in climate projections going forward. Are we heading towards a 3.5 degree warming world, an 8.5 degree warming world? And what does any of this mean for our capability to respond? So all of these challenges you will confront at one point or another while you try to aggregate these data sources and make decisions about your heat strategy. I'll give briefly a case study for what this might look like that Arup has delivered in the Americas and around the world. We've developed a tool called UHeat, which allows us to produce spatial maps of the urban heat island effect. And we used it to study 10 cities globally. What you see on the screen is a screenshot of what we produced for Madrid in Spain, where we observed the largest urban heat island intensity of any of the studies, any of the cities that we studied, 8.5 degrees between the hottest part of the study, the hottest part of the city that we found compared to the rural. And in the Americas, on the next slide, you'll see two examples that we did as part of the same project, one in Los Angeles and one in New York City. And since I'm in New York, and maybe you're familiar with the geography of New York City shown on the right, you'll see Central Park in the middle of Manhattan, but in the bottom left of this image is much cooler, shown in much cooler tones than the surrounding area. And you'll also see parts of the Bronx in the north and northwest, which are closer to the water, which are generally cooler during a heat wave. And so understanding the effect that greenery, the effect that water, the effect that built up areas has on the experience of heat is somewhat intuitive when you see a map like this. So I'll conclude the section about analysis by highlighting a few key points. The first is understanding what you're facing comes first. Before you can respond to urban heat, it's important to know where, when, and why heat is occurring, and to prioritize your response to reflect that. The second is that there are many data sources available and many tools also available to convert those data sources into insights. And lastly, it's that these insights will allow you to prioritize your resources and ultimately prevent the negative impacts to vulnerable communities or infrastructure that you prioritize. And last, I'll restate the disclaimer. You don't need perfect data to get started. You don't need capabilities to manipulate all of the different data sources that we identified. Using what you have and the skills that you have is very likely to help you understand key insights and start planning your response. So start where you are. Start where you are. In the next section, I'll talk about how do we understand the heat risks and impacts to the city itself. And I'm going to be talking more specifically and at some length about risk and vulnerability. But what that translates to, the whole, is what are the impacts to the city? Which are the impacts that the city wants to prioritize remediating? So are these impacts to people? Are these impacts to infrastructure? Are these other kinds of impacts, perhaps economic impacts? Which are the city's priority? That's what this section is about. So in the next slide, I give a fairly technical definition of risk. And on the slide after, you'll see in a moment maybe an image that helps bring it home. But risk, strictly speaking, is the probability of a given consequence occurring once we take into account the hazard itself, in this case heat, who or what is exposed to that hazard, and what is their vulnerability to that hazard. So on the next slide, we'll see this, that hazard, vulnerability, and exposure come together to produce what we can call risk. I want to give an example that illustrates it. Let's imagine that in a certain neighborhood in a certain city, the urban heat island intensity is 4 degrees above, say, a rural surrounding. So that gives some indication of what the hazard would be. Let's imagine in this neighborhood there are 3 people waiting at an outdoor bus stop. One is an elderly person, one is a child, one is a university student. The university student is less likely, just given their age, to be vulnerable to heat as compared to the elderly person and the child. And then let's say the bus doesn't arrive on time. The 3 people are then exposed for a longer period of time than they might otherwise be if the bus had arrived. All of these 3 factors go into describing their risk, and they can change over time as exposures change, as vulnerabilities change, and as the hazard changes. And we need to consider this not only in the case of people, as I described, or built environment assets, but we need to think on the scale of livelihoods and ecosystems, biological and human constructed, economic, social, and cultural ways as well. On the next slide, you'll see a list of impacts, not an exhaustive one that we showed previously, that explain or maybe illustrate that a holistic approach here is essential to understand how these impacts are interconnected and diverse in nature. Their impacts to people in the form of injuries, health conditions, fatalities, their impacts to ecosystems in terms of biodiversity loss, their general well-being impacts in terms of comfort, ability to human resilience is significantly affected by heat, emotional resilience, the ability to be, say, a good citizen to your neighbors, things like this. General well-being is substantially affected by heat. There are the exacerbated conditions, underlying conditions that heat can cause. For example, respiratory illnesses, kidney illnesses, and the like are made worse by heat. There are lost revenues of property value. There are lost their economic costs of operation. I'll give some examples of direct and secondary consequences that might not be obvious. In high heat conditions, airports are less less operable because planes can't take off in higher temperatures because the air is a lower density. So as temperatures increase, the throughput at airports will decrease. There are secondary risks as well because fires caused by electricity wires that sag in high heat can become wildfires that devastate whole communities. So the consequences of heat range in scale. They're hugely diverse in the kinds of impacts that we want to understand and prioritize mitigating. In the next slide, we'll talk about what a risk assessment could include, because ultimately it's a risk assessment that will inform your strategy for combating extreme heat. Risk assessments can be of different levels of complexity. And so from left to right on the screen, they're generally increasing in complexity. You might start with a hazard screening, which identifies the kinds of hazards that you'd face. And this can be very high level. It could identify, for example, from historical sources that heat is an issue and flooding not. And we saw, I think, from the poll at the beginning that it seems that folks listening today do have an understanding of, relatively speaking, which hazards are more crucial for them. You could progress to a risk screening that goes beyond just characterizing the hazard and now includes information about exposure and vulnerability. And this could be preliminary, it could be qualitative, which uses descriptive scales like low risk, medium risk, high risk. A greater complexity is a quantitative assessment, or one that blends quantitative and qualitative, and it introduces the different risk levels. So introducing more granularity than low, medium, and high, perhaps introducing some kind of numeric description. And finally, there's risk modeling, which can be highly quantitative, and it can model to a great degree of specificity some of these numeric characterizations like cost or number of fatalities. On the next slide, we illustrate this as well. Where qualitative assessments, which would generally be faster, probably easier to produce, but give slightly less information. You're producing outputs like low, medium, and high risk characterizations. These could be spatialized to identify hotspots. But as you introduce different data sources, maybe numeric data sources and different algorithms for computing, you can estimate numeric outputs like financial loss, like number of fatalities, etc. And what they can help you answer, and by answering this question, help you justify, is what is the cost of inaction? Therefore, how much can we invest to support taking action today? If we did nothing, if the world warmed at a certain characteristic trajectory, what would be the costs to our city against any of these different kinds of impacts that we've discussed? On the next slide, you'll see that it's important to consider present day and future risks. And we've talked about one kind of future scenario, which is different warming scenarios. Of course, it's important to use robust ones. There are many models that are well vetted and produced by academic communities that describe what some of these trajectories can look like for different regions around the world. But it's important also to consider data sets about urbanization, for example. Is your city growing very quickly? Is your city developing in a way that it's turning green space over to habitable space? Do you have projections about how that will take place over the next years and decades? And when you select time horizons, for example, planning for 2030, planning for 2050, planning for 2080, you need to be thinking not only in terms of how will the climate change over that period, but also how will the city change? Finally, if you've done a risk assessment that considers these various factors, on the next slide, Rashmi, thank you, you'll find that, well, you've produced the risk assessment. The question is now, how do you use its outputs? The first one is to prioritize among the risks. So which areas of intervention are your first priority? These could be hotspots in the city, for example, that are particularly at risk, or it could be by receptor or sector, for example. Do we want to address housing stock? Do we want to address transit infrastructure? Once you've prioritized, then the question is which adaptation interventions are appropriate. And these can be physical or they can be non-physical. When we say physical, perhaps some of these are obvious things like introducing shade trees, introducing water features or cooling centers, things like that. And Maggie will describe many of these. But they can also be non-physical. They can be about changing operations, shifting work hours to cooler periods of the day, for example, which is common in some parts of the world already. And finally, if there are residual risks that can't be addressed by some of your adaptation interventions, are there ways to cleverly manage this, for example, through insurance products? And we see already the invention of many kinds of insurance products. You might hear the word parametric insurance, for example, that pay out according to certain kinds of objective criteria. For example, the temperature on a given day exceeded a certain amount, a person is paid out because they are less productive or unable to attend work. And these sorts of risk products are being developed not only at the individual and organizational scale, but potentially for use at the city scale as well. So I'll conclude this section by giving a case study from the US city of Boston, where they developed a heat hazard map by neighborhood, and then they overlaid that with socioeconomic data that indicated a level of vulnerability of the population, again, spatially. And what this helped them identify was areas with unequal heat risk, and also, therefore, the areas where they wanted to prioritize where to introduce cooling amenities. And these amenities were things like shade trees, water features, sprinklers, cooling centers that I identified, which were made available to people in neighborhoods that didn't have, so that the people most at risk were better served by the city. I'll conclude again with a few key points. So risk assessments should be holistic in that they consider the variety of different kinds of impacts, social, environmental, financial, that heat has on cities. They should be forward-looking and thinking not only about climate projections, but also changes in the urban fabric over time. And with well-defined time horizons, hopefully some of that is easy to quantify. And finally, these risk assessments should be action-oriented, so they should support evidence-based decision-making and planning to respond to the specific risks identified therein. So we'll stop there for a moment. We'll put another poll. Well, there are a couple of polls that we'll put on the screen, and we'll pause also for a 5-minute break before we review the results of the poll, and then Maggie will take over for discussion of planning actions. So what I'd ask is, again, we'll put the links in the chat. If you can please respond, and over the course of the next 5 minutes, we'll collect your responses, and then we'll reconvene in 5 minutes, review those responses, and then continue together. And I'd say in the meanwhile, if you have any questions, please feel free to add those to the chat. We can collate them for the Q&A session at the end. Okay. Thanks, everybody. 5 minutes.
So just to jump in, for those of you that are trying to answer the forms and are having some troubles with that, feel free to use the chat function to interact instead, and hopefully we can get this up and running at some point throughout the webinar. Apologies for the technical hold up, but I hope you're still able to answer via the chat function. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll give everybody maybe one more minute. But I see responses in the chat. Apologies that it's not working to use the link. But it seems that there are questions about sharing the presentation. I will defer that question to somebody else. I think the answer is yes, but I'll let somebody else confirm. But to the query on the screen, we see answers about resource restrictions, limited staff capacity, limited funding, interdepartmental coordination, which of course can exacerbate some of the complexities around using different kinds of data sources or translating outcomes, translating those outputs into action by different departments. I'd invite people to continue, please putting your answers in the chat if you're interested. In the meanwhile, I'll hand to my colleague, Maggie Messerschmidt, to join for the second section.
Great. I'll kick us off with this section, which is dedicated to the ACT portion of the Analyze, Assess, and ACT framework. And here we're talking specifically about planning, and then we'll get into some of the solutions specifically. And this is oriented to what city governments can do to adapt to heat. On the next slide, we define what heat resilience planning attempts to achieve. Specifically, that is the identification and integration of solutions that deliver impacts that can be tracked and measured. And I really appreciate the slogan that you can't manage what you can't measure. That is partially true. There's plenty to be done without intensive data management, as we noted in the beginning of the presentation. Adam mentioned that, but certainly tracking progress is a key part of heat action planning. On the next slide, these are, I'll kind of walk you through what we have identified as the key components of accelerating action on heat across cities. So the first one, maybe particularly obvious, is to identify impactful solutions. We've been working with cities like Los Angeles and New Orleans. Previously, I worked with the city of Phoenix, and each city's solutions are slightly unique and relevant to what their residents are encountering. The next one is around shared outcomes, driving towards shared outcomes. A lot of you mentioned this concept, I think, in the response there around the importance of coordinating across departments. And heat action is definitely important to coordinate across departments that are already perhaps driving forward on heat action, and then also to recognize the gaps there. And then at the center, of course, is equity. As Adam noted, social vulnerability is not equal across cities. And so identifying where there are gaps or vulnerability socially is really key to addressing some of the question of where investment should be made and where they're most needed. And then next, it's important to clarify the causal relationship between actions that you're taking, the cost of inaction, and the KPIs, or the metrics that are going to show that there is a shift in anything between heat related illnesses and deaths, or thermal comfort, or other livability outcomes. And then finally, the importance of building accountability and governance is important for creating a framework to support implementation and accountability. Without any of these elements, a heat action plan could sit on a shelf, which is not the idea. The idea is absolutely for implementation and change and transition across the city. So on to the next slide. as I mentioned, one of the important components here is driving towards shared outcomes. So by focusing on heat systemically, you can amplify some of those resilience and sustainability outcomes across the city that you may already be tracking, things like grid resilience, access to nature and green and open space, air quality, decarbonization. Heat action focuses specifically on reducing deaths and illnesses, but it is also about making the built environment more livable and reinforcing resilience of the systems that sustain health and well-being. So on to the next slide. We tend to focus heat actions into 3 categories. The first one is around awareness. That includes things like public education, community engagement, and advocacy. Just having an ability to recognize heat risks and recognize that even when we're not in a heat wave, there are components of heat risk. And then preparedness has to do more with things like early warning systems or grid resilience, the development of first response systems or street brigades, and health safety protocols. And in the third category, we focus on the built environment to reduce the urban heat island effect or to increase thermal comfort through actions such as passive cooling, smart surfaces, waste heat management, or even urban form, which could include things like street access orientation or wind flows, or more or things that we know about too, like green and blue infrastructure, which include trees and shade and some of the more obvious solutions. On the next slide, as part of our framework for heat action planning, we seek solutions that correlate to measurable outcomes. So important to kind of track how your KPIs are associated with the actions that you're taking. In this example here, we're tracking the relationship between strategies, actions, and outcomes. So a strategy of increased shade equity can result in 3,000 shaded bus shelters in high heat risk locations, with an aim of at least 75% of riders boarding shaded bus stops by the time-bound target of 2030. Which ultimately contributes to that improved thermal comfort and mobility. So really linking strategies to outcomes is key, and then measuring those over time. In terms of the next slide, identifying the cost of heat impacts, that can be important for making the case for investing in heat actions. Adam covered some of these, but just to clarify how we make the case for investment, part of that is looking at the research that quantifies the costs and relates cost metrics specifically to the anticipated future conditions. So, for example, we have studies that show that temperatures that feel like 103 degrees Fahrenheit and higher represent a higher degree of heat danger, and that corresponds to an increase of ER visits and hospitalizations, and we can put a cost metric on those. Other studies show that worker productivity declines almost 1 hour per day at temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And we can see up to 13 or 14 injuries per 100,000 people that occur in outdoor workplaces at those temperatures. And then likewise, the rate of infrastructure degradation increases with increasing heat. So for example, the rate of asphalt aging increases by 3 to 4% per degree Celsius. And then in terms of our energy management, we see transformer capacity decreases, and we see the need to bring on new power generation that must fill the gap of the increasing demand for cooling. So applying findings like that to our projections on temperature allow us to quantify the potential costs of heat without mitigation. And then on to the next slide. So groups like Smart Surfaces Coalition, the IFC, and UNEP School Coalition have been working to quantify the benefits associated with heat resilience solutions. On the graphic on the left, this comes from UNEP's Global Cooling Emissions Model. It shows that using passive strategies could result in developing economies needing to invest 940 billion less in electricity generation over 25 years between 2025 and 2050. Likewise, on the right, we see some of the calculations from the Smart Surfaces Coalition, where they analyzed the collective benefits of smart surfaces in 10 US metropolitan areas. And those benefits include things like reduced maintenance costs, reductions to peak energy demand, and of course, reductions in heat-related illnesses and deaths, all which can be put to a cost metric. So from this body of work, we know that while economic benefits are clear, they are still not being fully driven by regulations or standards that would encourage broader adoption. So some of the highest paybacks on investment now are coming from simple solutions like early warning systems or passive cooling, things like cool roofs, cool pavements, or green infrastructure. The market for cooling is anticipated to grow, but it does require investments in research and development, technologies, and capital. But as mentioned, some of the lowest hanging fruit can come from amplifying current investments in energy efficiency, healthcare, and preparedness. So on to the next slide. Driving adoption of cooling solutions forward does require good policy. It spans from incentivizing changes in the built environment, such as building performance standards or the use of cool materials, including both in buildings and across the built environment, to policies for preparedness and response. So these can include things like reducing the impacts of power outages on residents and keeping people safe while they perform higher risk jobs. And then moving on to the next slide, we show some examples of the KPIs that we can track. So we've been working with cities to identify ones that are appropriate for them. That could include things like reducing the percent of impervious surfaces across the city. I mentioned reducing the cost of power outages, specifically on residents, and creating improved access to shade or to cooling centers or resilience hubs. And then finally, bringing it all together on the next slide is the importance of driving coordination and accountability across the city. And this is a major challenge for cities. I will say a lot of times it's an Office of Resilience or Sustainability or Emergency Management that is tasked with heat action planning. They provide the ownership and alignment and oversight across all departments, but that really does require buy-in and support from the top down across the city. One thing that can really help is to assign clear roles and responsibilities. We've used things like a RACI chart, which accounts for responsibilities and accountabilities or informing or consulting roles within the city. And then that cross-department collaboration, again, key between departments like health departments, planning departments, and even outside of the city, for example, with utilities. And that kind of coordination, of course, can help to amplify efforts that are ongoing, and it reduces duplication and supports the work of plan alignment. And then finally, the importance of sharing data both on programmatic outputs like those KPIs, but also around heat vulnerability and the changing physical environment is also important. So on to the next slide. heat action planning requires collaboration. This is key, from policymakers to planners to community organizations. We know that social cohesion is one of the greatest factors to improve resilience outcomes. This is true across many climate hazards, not just heat. So we recognize here the importance of community to government relationships as part of that social capital. I just want to give a couple examples. Let's see, first, I mentioned that we were doing some of this heat action planning with the city of Los Angeles. They came to us at Arup with a vision for heat resilience, but needed more strategic planning. So we worked with them to develop 20 heat action strategies, their KPIs, and a framework for coordinating heat action across the city. And that informs a heat action plan that is being developed with support from a grant from the state of California. And on to the next slide. Sorry, next one. This shows kind of how the city of Los Angeles is targeting investment in high-risk areas. So there are different ways to kind of show vulnerability and identify high heat risk areas, but ultimately they ended up going with this approach, which layers on the higher rates of excess emergency room visits due to heat with historically high pollution burden, which we call our EJ communities or environmental justice communities, and then areas where the greater percent of income goes to covering housing. So we identified that as the kind of indicators of high heat risk. And then on the next slide, just showing how the different plans that come into play for heat action planning. So of course, like you may have your own bespoke heat action plan, but that should echo and amplify and reinforce some of the actions that may be in related to heat and emergency operations plans or parks master plans or hazard mitigation plans, and then as well as cities CAPs. However, those actions may not be sufficient. So it's important to also identify the gaps that may be not covered in any of those plans. So there's a little bit of a process of prioritization and gap identification in order to get to that final bespoke heat action plan. And then on the next slide, this is a template that we've been working with in Los Angeles and in New Orleans. And this, what we found helpful is to kind of identify these tracks. We mentioned those kind of 3 categories of planning. So the tracks might align with those types of solutions. But here the track is heat response. The strategy is about coordinating heat response services, including EMTs, crisis response, and street brigades. There is a rationale specifically related to reducing the number of heat-related illnesses and deaths, and action around deployment, specifically during heat waves, a responsible department that is leading, and then metrics that are reported on to the city and to the public. Okay, and then on to the next slide. Some of you, I think, are on the call are probably very familiar with this. In 2023, there was record temperatures in Rio de Janeiro, and the heat wave was linked to nearly 1,400 deaths in a single month. And this was a real turning point for Rio, where they established this protocol around real-time weather data and health system data. And so this early warning system, kind of came in on the back of a warning system around flood, but there was nothing in existence for heat. And again, this is one of the highest benefit actions, lowest cost solutions. So those early warning systems really being key in terms of planning for heat risk. And I know we're kind of short on time, but I want to get through the next slide. So I'm going to move on to our solutions, 2 slides down. Okay. So again, we talked about those 3 categories of solutions, awareness, preparedness, and redesign. On the next slide, we talk about the layers of solutions, how integrating solutions across the neighborhood, building scale, and even individual scale is key. The most effective heat strategies are combining these layers. They're functioning together, not in isolation. And they do provide those co-benefits that we talked about, things like mobility, health, decarbonization, equity. So the layering of the social fabric is key. At the building scale, on the next slide, these are some of the lower cost solutions that can be done without major retrofits. Things like a lower G value film on a window can be a very low cost solution. Fans and ventilation and just basic shading. On the next slide, slightly higher cost solutions include things like installing ceiling fans, external shutters, cool roofs or roof insulation, or even window replacement instead of just those window films can support cooler passive solutions. But the message here is that all of these passive cooling solutions can really reduce heat permanently and improve thermal comfort, even without mechanical cooling. On the next slide, I just wanted to share some more examples. In the communities of Nacajuca and Totolapan, and those are respectively in Tabasco and Morelos. Arup worked with Échale, which is Mexico's largest social housing constructor, to apply cool paints to 92 roofs and did a pilot testing cool roof paints and coatings. This was also related to kind of creating a workforce that was prepared to deliver the solution. And so they provided, for example, PPE to the folks that were being trained on the application of these materials. And following this pilot project, HLA continued to work with community partners on cool roof installations in 8 different states around Mexico. On the next slide, you can see that this is combating issues of thermal comfort and also heat illness in housing, and this includes combating impacts like poor sleep or spoiling food or exacerbating illness like diabetes. So just the simple solution of coatings on rooftops is making a bigger difference. At the neighborhood scale on the next slide, we see a lot of opportunity for urban greening and green infrastructure that can include things like green roofs or green facades or vertical gardens, pocket parks. Blue infrastructure refers to our system of waterways around the city, but it can also include things like water fountains and splash parks or misting systems. And of course, like restoring natural wetlands or natural water bodies can be very, very key for maximizing cooling benefits. So these strategies provide some of the most effective and long-lasting cooling benefits, and then they provide those co-benefits, of course, like biodiversity and health and public space. An example of that comes from Quito, where nature-based solutions are being applied throughout the city through an initiative called Clever Cities. And interestingly, this is really tied to social cohesion and inclusive urban regeneration because of unregulated growth. Oh, on the next slide. Because of unregulated growth, there's kind of the dual impact of climate hazards, things like landslides and flooding, but also combined with isolation of certain communities. So working in ravines and in communities that are not that are not central. They may not have utilities, but improving holistic community-driven approach to cooling and climate adaptation through nature-based solutions. And I think I will stop there in the interest of time, and so that we have time for questions. I think on the last slide, we have some resources that we'd like to share with you. One slide back. Yeah, there you go. So since we'll be sharing these slides around, yeah, you encouraged to take a look at all of these sources. It includes a handbook for cities, urban heat management in the Global South, and a primer for cool cities from the World Bank, as well as guidance on conducting a risk assessment at the city scale. All right, and thank you everyone for joining us. We can open it up for questions. I believe that it is okay to ask questions in the chat and we can field them that way.
And Rashmi, you said that we're going to share the presentation with everyone. So these last resources that were at the last slides that Maggie talked about, we could make sure that everybody has access to this little list, right, as well.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll be sharing the slides and the recordings afterwards so that people can rewatch it if they missed it or if they missed any of the slides that were shared. Great. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Adam. So feel free to post questions and between the team and I will read them out and direct them to our experts. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to gather their questions.
I was wondering if I can jump in as we wait for questions and just kind of say a couple of thoughts that I had while Adam was talking. And I was thinking that I love this challenges mapping that you created with the different types of data and the different types of difficulties that cities have with, and you talked about incorporating data in, the type of data sets that they already have or the type of platforms that they already had, and a list of things. And I was thinking another problem that a lot of cities face is the how to ask the right kind of questions that lead to the right kind of data sets, and what kind of data sets are the right data sets that can satisfy the kind of question that you have. Like, for example, you don't necessarily need to know every tree. Like for example, you need, if you have land surface temperatures, you might not need any other kind of temperature depending on what kind of solutions you want to prioritize, or if you want, which might have to do with, with where you want to put your green infrastructure, or you don't need every tree to do specific. So what I'm trying to say is that it sometimes it's difficult for cities and they need some help to identify what kind of data sets they need and how to ask the right kind of question for the kind. That's it. I just was thinking about that. Thought I would mention it.
I think it's a good point. It inspires me maybe to reply this way, which is to ask the right questions. I think in part requires the city maybe to think about its priorities in the first instance. And often, at least in my experience, the city's priority could be around something like the health and well-being of citizens.
Right.
And so this inspires questions like which citizens are most vulnerable, or what are the factors that affect vulnerability. Those vulnerable people, how do they experience heat? Where do they spend time when they're exposed to heat or protected from heat, etc. And so I think, to your point, finding the right data requires asking the right questions. And I think to ask the right questions requires some initial understanding of priority. And it may be that after
point.
you've collected data, the story is different. Maybe you reprioritize. Maybe you identify that certain kinds of risks from heat are more extreme than you perceived at the outset, and you decide to look for other data sets.
I see a question in the chat around grid resilience, which I would love to answer. I think I mentioned that we've been working in this with the city of New Orleans, where the double or compounding events of storms, of tropical storms combined with heat can be really impactful and result in things like brownouts or blackouts in power, which can, of course, in addition to the health risk, can lead to things like food spoilage and big business, small business impacts. So grid resilience refers to kind of building in the backup power or the redundancy or the demand management. Sometimes the impact of heat on the grid can be, by alone can kind of increase peak loads to a degree that there's just not enough power available. So grid resilience has to do with creating that capacity, that redundancy, in the case of outages, any kind of maybe even battery supply or backup power, especially for important places like hospitals or senior housing where people are especially vulnerable. And it also can include things like microgrids or distributed energy solutions. And so we've seen an example of that in Chicago, where they're working on, kind of these super blocks of distributed energy and district cooling. So there's a hub called the Garfield Center where I think they're focusing on kind of like a whole microgrid block, and it's very much in the works right now. But it does incorporate a cooling center where people can go in the case of a heat wave and power outage, and go and be able to charge their medical devices that are dependent on power, or other kind of life saving interventions can be especially managed through those cooling centers that are tied to those grid resilient solutions. All right.
Thank you, Maggie. I can see we have another few questions in the chat as well. So one of them being on, oh, sorry, I see you can read it. Would you like to take the second question that came in?
Sure. There's a couple examples that we didn't quite get to that I think answer the next two questions really well. One was around green infrastructure and informal settlements, especially I think an issue in Latin America, where there's not more available space, and green roofs are not really an option because of the added weight of green roofs, and they're asking for an inspiring case. If you go back a few slides, Reshmi, to slide 74, this is an example from Medellin where they focused on green corridors. And so I think, buildings as one opportunity, but also not forgetting the opportunity that is our streets, and kind of using our streets and pedestrian or bike pathways as opportunities to kind of enhance cool and green corridors. In Medellin, the city created 30 interconnected green corridors and more than 20 kilometers of shaded biodiverse routes that included over 8,000 trees and 90,000 plants, which led to temperature reductions of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. And of course, that's tied to significant improvements in air quality, and then green jobs opportunities for people to be trained as gardeners or planting technicians as part of a green jobs effort across the city. So maybe that is one good example of green infrastructure. And then for the next question around heat governance, do you have any interesting examples of heat governance implemented at the municipal level or even on a multi-level approach? Let's see, trying to think. One example we didn't share was the cool roofs across New York, but again, that was a kind of associated with a workforce training program. And Adam, maybe you can even speak to this with your work on cool roofs in Mexico. But I think the dual nature of tying workforce training efforts to those cooling solutions can really help to kind of work across departments and maybe support some of the economic development goals of a city.
I can add to that to give some context for what has taken place in New York City and New York State. I think in the question asking about a multi-level approach, what I understand from that is, if there are different authorities maybe and they have different interests, how do those relate? The New York example is an interesting one because this is now maybe 15 years old or older, but there was a Cool Roofs program that Maggie alluded to, which was in part a job training program, or it had a component related to job training that was quite central to the program design. And it was very successful in terms of how much roof area was covered with reflective paint. And if you look at satellite images, of New York today, you see that many buildings have these kinds of roofs. Of course, not all of them were painted as part of this program, but many municipal ones were. And then rules came up to support the painting or the increase in reflectivity on other buildings, non-public buildings during major renovations. So that was a municipal approach that was piloted before, at least as far as I'm aware, any state level approach was implemented. But New York State now, which is a different governing authority that has authority over many cities, of course, but also other agencies, has commissioned maps for the entire state. The maps are, by now, they rely on more sophisticated algorithms. They rely on more sophisticated satellite imagery. Of course, they're more current, so they are intended to be more, I say more reflective, not meaning to make a joke, but more reflective of the current condition. And one of the immediate outputs from it is, a sense of which neighborhoods are hotspots during heat events. And so I hope this is answering the question, because it doesn't strictly relate to governance at both the city and state level. I'm not aware of legislation at the state level that creates the same mandatory requirements as legislation that's existing at the city level. But we do see this interplay between the governments at each level and what their capabilities are and their priorities at different points in time. So hopefully that's illustrative of that answers the question, or helps answer the question.
Well, I will say that the heat action planning that I've done for cities is not easy, because it does require a lot of coordination and mayoral support, and that can shift. We're seeing in the U.S. a lot of shifts in our offices of resilience and sustainability that happened to us recently with our work in New Orleans. Even as mayors are endorsing climate action, dealing with things like budget crises. And so I think the idea of integration and really baking in heat action planning is very key. Developing a task force for implementation is also important. It needs to go beyond, it needs to reach beyond the kind of the driving department or organization. But internal buy-in and support is critical.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Maggie. And thank you, Lenio, as well. I believe we're at time.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Go for it, Lenio, for some concluding remarks, maybe.
Yes, I would like to close by saying, first of all, I want to thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Arup for organizing this very, very interesting webinar. And Rashmi, thank you very much for bringing us all together and holding our hands through this. I want to say that I just want to add to the last question that I think one of the best examples worldwide for multi-level governance and for different levels of governance in relation to heat is in India right now. And UNEP is doing really amazing work that combines policies that are being taken at the level of India, like as as a whole, as a country, and then linked to specific states like Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra, and then from there to specific cities that are working on things. And we're really very, very happy and very looking forward to moving this type of work at with other governments. U.S. had started doing a similar thing with the previous government, but now it's falling apart. But we had this kind of multi-level governance efforts as well a few last years. Anyway, I want to finish with reminding everybody to make sure when you get the forms of the survey from us, that all the cities please fill it out so that we could make sure that we understand better at what level you are with your heat need and what are the things that you prioritize. Super important. It should be easy and it shouldn't take a lot of your time, but it's really, really important for us to actually build the whole program. We'll build the whole program on your answers. This is one, and just these couple of questions that we had in this survey today showed very interesting aspects. Like, it's the first thing has to do with capacity sometimes and not with funding. So at this point, I want to thank everyone again and wish you all a great day. And see you soon again through this program, which I'm hoping is going to be a really substantial one. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Anyway, thank you all.
Good.